necessity, the front ones sharp, adapted for dividing, and the grinders flat, and serviceable for masticating the food, since they were not made for the sake of this, but it was the result of accident. And in like manner as to the other parts in which there appears to exist an adaptation to an end. Wheresoever, therefore, all things together, that is, all the parts of one whole, happened like as if they were made for the sake of something, these were preserved, having been appropriately constituted by an internal spontaneity. And whatsoever things were not thus constituted, perished and still perish. We see here the principle of natural selection shadowed forth, but how little Aristotle fully comprehended the principle is shown by his remarks on the formation of the teeth. But as Buffon's opinions fluctuated greatly at different periods, and as he does not enter on the causes or means of the transformation of species, I need not here enter on details. Lamarck was the first man whose conclusions on the subject excited much attention. This justly celebrated naturalist first published his views in 1801. He much enlarged them in 1809 in his Philosophie zoologique, and subsequently in 1815 in the introduction to his Histoire nationale des animaux sans vertèbres. In these works he upholds the doctrine that species, including man, are descended from other species. He first did the eminent service of arousing attention to the probability of all change in the organic as well as in the inorganic world, being the result of law and not of miraculous interposition. Lamarck seems to have been chiefly led to his conclusion on the gradual change of species by the difficulty of distinguishing species and varieties, by the almost perfect gradation of forms in certain groups, and by the analogy of domestic productions. With respect to the means of modification, he attributed something to the direct action of the physical conditions of life, something to the crossing of already existing forms, and much to use and disuse, that is, to the effects of habit. To this latter agency he seemed to attribute all the beautiful adaptations in nature, such as the long neck of the giraffe for browsing on the branches of trees. But he likewise believed in a law of progressive development, and as all the forms of life thus tend to progress, in order to account for the existence at the present day of simple productions, he maintains that such forms are now spontaneously generated. I have taken the date of the first publication of Lamarck from Icide, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire's Histoire nationale générale, excellent history of opinion on this subject. In this work a full account is given of Buffon's conclusions on the same subject. It is curious how largely my grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, anticipated the views and erroneous grounds of opinion of Lamarck in his Zoonomia, published in 1794. According to Isidore Geoffroy, there is no doubt that Goethe was an extreme partisan of similar views, as shown in the introduction to a work written in 1794 and 1795, but not published till long afterwards. He has pointedly remarked, Goethe als Naturforscher, von Dr. Karl Medding, that the future question for naturalists will be how, for instance, cattle got their horns, and not for what they are used. It is rather a singular instance of the manner in which similar views arise at about the same time, that Goethe in Germany, Dr. Darwin in England, and Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, as we shall immediately see, in France, came to the same conclusion on the origin of species in the years 1794 to 1795. Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, as is stated in his Life, written by his son, suspected as early as 1795 that what we call species are various degenerations of the same type. It was not until 1828 that he published his conviction that the same forms have not been perpetuated since the origin of all things. Geoffroy seems to have relied chiefly on the conditions of life, or the monde ambiant, as the cause of change. He was cautious in drawing conclusions, and did not believe that existing species are now undergoing modification, and, as his son adds, C'est donc un problème réservé entièrement à l'avenir. Supposez même que l'avenir doive avoir pris sur lui. In 1813, Dr. W.C. Wells read before the Royal Society an account of a white female, part of whose skin resembled that of a Negro. But his paper was not published until his famous 2 Essays upon Due and Single Vision appeared in 1818. In this paper he distinctly recognizes the principle of natural selection, and this is the first recognition which has been indicated, but he applies it only to the races of man, and to certain characters alone. After remarking that Negroes and mulattoes enjoy an immunity from certain tropical diseases, he observes firstly that all animals tend to vary in some degree, and secondly that agriculturists improve their domesticated animals by selection. And then he adds, but what is done in this latter case, by art, seems to be done with equal efficacy, though more slowly, by nature, in the formation of varieties of mankind, fitted for the country which they inhabit. Of the accidental varieties of man, which would occur among the first few and scattered inhabitants of the middle regions of Africa, some would be better fitted than the others to bear the diseases of the country. This race would consequently multiply, while the others would decrease, not only from their inability to sustain the attacks of disease, but from their incapacity of contending with their more vigorous neighbors. The color of this vigorous race, I take for granted, from what has been already said, would be dark. But the same disposition to form varieties still existing, a darker and a darker race would in the course of time occur. And as the darkest would be the best fitted for the climate, this would at length become the most prevalent, if not the only race, in the particular country in which it had originated. He then extends these same views to the white inhabitants of colder climates. I am indebted to Mr. Rowley of the United States for having called my attention, through Mr. Brace, to the above passage in Dr. Wells's work. The Honourable and Reverend W. Herbert, afterwards Dean of Manchester, in the 4th volume of the Horticultural Transactions, 1822, and in his work on the Amaryllidaceae, declares that horticultural experiments have established, beyond the possibility of refutation, that botanical species are only a higher and more permanent class of varieties. He extends the same view to animals. The Dean believes that single species of each genus were created in an originally highly plastic condition, and that these have produced, chiefly by intercrossing, but likewise by variation, all our existing species. In 1826, Professor Grant, in the concluding paragraph in his well-known paper, Edinburgh Philosophical Journal, on the Spongilla, clearly declares his belief that species are descended from other species, and that they become improved in the course of modification. The same view was given in his 55th lecture, published in the Lancet in 1834. In 1831, Mr. Patrick Matthew published his work on Naval Timber and Arboriculture, in which he gives precisely the same view on the origin of species as that, presently to be alluded to, propounded by Mr. Wallace and myself in the Linnean Journal, and as that enlarged in the present volume. Unfortunately, the view was given by Mr. Matthew very briefly in scattered passages in an appendix to a work on a different subject, so that it remained unnoticed until Mr. Matthew himself drew attention to it in the Gardner Chronicle on April 7, 1860. The differences of Mr. Matthew's view from mine are not of much importance. He seems to consider that the world was nearly depopulated at successive periods, and then restocked. And he gives, as an alternative, that new forms may be generated without the presence of any mold or germ of former aggregates. I am not sure that I understand some passages, but it seems that he attributes much influence to the direct action of the conditions of life. He clearly saw, however, the full force of the principle of natural selection. The celebrated geologist and naturalist von Buch, in his excellent Description physique des îles Canaries, 1836, clearly